Good evening and welcome to the third in our series of webinars on Wednesday. I'm really pleased this evening to be joined by Andrew Roberts, who's written the book Holy Habits, if you're wondering where you knew Andrew's name from. Before we get going and I kind of hand over our responsibility to Andrew and reform questions, just a bit of a plug for next month. It's going to be kind of a week later in the month. Next month, it'll be the 23rd of September, where we're really pleased to be joined with Mark Green, who was or still is, for a short time, the director of the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity, and has written his book Faith on the Front Line. And I think it will complement really, really nicely what we're going to talk about tonight. It kind of moves us on in the next step in the discussion and the journey. So that's for next month, and we'll think about that then. Andrew, good evening.
Good evening.
I hope you're well, melting in this heat that we're all experiencing at the moment. Although we shouldn't complain, because I believe in some places the rain has already arrived, and we'll still be moaning about how wet it is. Perhaps we could just start by just because clearly you don't just land one day and think, oh no, I'll write a book. Perhaps you could just give us some background to what brought you to the place where you thought you'd write down what is clearly your experience of ministry and what you've found together.
Well, that's right, Stuart. I mean, Holy Habits is in some ways semi-autobiographical, actually, because there's a lot of my sort of personal story and testimony in there, and a lot of the stories of the people that I've had the privilege of knowing, working with, ministering alongside, and so on over the years. So, you know, it's been a long time in the making, really. I think there's stories in there from my time at university, for example, when I was a student in York. I was blessed to be there at the time that David Watson was at St. Michael of Belfry. That was a massively important formative time for me. So, yeah, I mean, practically in 2015, I had a sabbatical. A few years before that, I'd done a master's degree. And as part of that degree, I'd done a module on Acts. I'd written an essay based on the anchor passage for Holy Habits, Acts 2:42 to 47. The question was, to what extent do we see the picture that Luke paints there reappearing in Fresh Expressions of Church today? And as I was working for the Fresh Expressions team at the time, that seemed a good question to answer. So the actual genesis of the book in written form was that essay I did as part of the master's degree that got rewritten for a theological journal and then stayed on the shelf for a while. But with sabbatical coming up, I'd always had that little niggle, is there something more to be developed here? And that gave me the time to really assemble the book. Because when it comes to writing, I think I'm more of an assembler than a sort of prosaic sit down and just write away sort of person. So that gave me the time to do it, and then, you know, being delighted and thrilled and amazed at how it's taken off following that.
That's fabulous. Because I know certainly in the area that I work in, the northwest of England, that lots of churches have been working through Holy Habits and looking at each one. You know, some over a couple of months, some over a month, whichever period works for them. And we are tonight going to be going through and looking and thinking about how all those habits apply to us now in this time when many of us find ourselves socially distanced or even socially isolated, sadly. But I know from talking to you and having looked through the book as well, there's kind of two main themes that you want to kind of start off with, isn't there? First of all, this idea that believers broke bread together at home. Do you want to say some more about that, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably get back to the breaking bread bit a little bit later on when we have a gallop through the habits. But I just think it's those two little words, at home, that struck me, actually, you know, when the COVID crisis was breaking, that here was a phrase from Luke that was very much for our time. One of the lovely things about the Acts 2:42 to 47 passage is whenever you read it, it seems that the Spirit brings something different to your attention. And so, you know, I still read it frequently. If I'm presenting about Holy Habits, I'll invite people to read that and notice what they notice. What's the Spirit saying to me today at this time through this very familiar text? And so when, you know, rumours of lockdown began to emerge and everything like that, I wrote a little blog actually about the phrase "at home," and just wondered aloud whether this, gift of a passage would be a gift to us again in these very challenging and difficult times when being at home was forced upon us. The vast majority of us stay at home, said the Prime Minister, and apart from his advisor, that's what we all did.
Yeah, we did indeed, yes. So I guess the other challenge that's almost the counter opposite to that idea of being at home and, in many cases being our own, is the idea that all believers were together.
Yes. Yeah. And again, I think that's another critical phrase in the passage. Again, I'll often speak about the sense of togetherness, the sense of community that Luke presents in the passage. All the believers were together. Whenever I say that, I'm always aware of Jimmy Dunn's comment that Luke's passage is undoubtedly idealized. So I think when Luke says all the believers were together, we need to filter that through that sort of idealized lens. But it probably means a great majority of them were in practice. So there is something important about togetherness in this text, and something important about togetherness being a key to the fruitfulness of living out holy habits. But as you rightly say, Stuart, when we are all confined to barracks, when we are all at home, in what sense and in what ways can we be together when actually for several months physical meeting was denied, and even now it's very, very carefully regulated and controlled. In the Methodist Church that I serve, we've just begun to open up again for Sunday worship, but it is very, very carefully monitored, and some people can come, some people can't come. So again, what does togetherness mean and look like in these days? It'd be interesting to get comments and questions from the participants about this as we go through this evening.
And absolutely, that's something we're very keen to do tonight. So if you've got any kind of questions or any thoughts that come from something that's said, then please don't hang on, just 5 minutes at the bottom of the question and answer bit, and we'll hopefully be able to engage with you in that way. I know Andrew, when we spoke, was really keen, weren't you, to be able to do that, to have a bit of a dialogue with people. So please feel free to ask some questions using the question and answer facility, which you should have at the bottom of your screen. So have you come up with any answers, I wonder, over this time when you've been socially isolated? We've not been, hopefully, on trips over to Durham at all. Have you come up with any ideas to challenge this idea of still being together whilst being apart?
Well, clearly, something like what we're doing now, I think is part of the response and part of the answer. I think we were aware pre-COVID that how online space is used within Christian fellowship, within Christian worship, within Christian mission is really, really important. And again, that's the crisis that we're living through has accelerated that learning and that exploration. So all of the online stuff, whether it's webinars like this, whether it's online worship, with Holy Habits, we ran a series of online home groups with BRF, which we did on a Facebook Live platform. And we're actually wonderful, dynamic, rich times of learning. And we found some things actually have been positively advantageous. So in those house groups, the level of interaction and participation, I think, was actually higher than we would have had if we'd have been in a physical space together, because people had to type in their comments. They really had to be concise. So you get maybe a couple of sentences of comment. I would respond to that, or somebody else would respond to that. So the level of interactivity and the level of shared learning, I think, was absolutely enormous. So I think we've learned some things of positive value, but equally, I think we must be honest. And, this is a deeply Christian thing to do. We do need to lament about what we've lost, hopefully temporarily, by not being able to be together physically. I mean, when lockdown began to be eased and it was permissible, I went to visit my youth leader, who's now in his 80s, a wonderful godly man. He does pop up in the Holy Habits book, actually, Alan Davis, if anybody's read the story. I got permission off his daughter to go and safely visit him at a social distance. And we met and we talked and we had the most wonderful time together. And at the end, I said, Alan, do you mind if I pray with you? And I found that a deeply moving experience. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed praying with somebody in physical space. I've prayed online. I did it in the home groups. I do it in other places as well. So there have been some gains, but there has been some losses. So we celebrate the gains and we lament the losses, I think.
Thanks. That's I found that really, really helpful. So let's, as we've been sort of talking about teaching, that seems like a good place to move on to the first one of those holy habits. We were laughing with Andrew before, as he said, so many people came up and quote his books to him at different conferences, and he said that he thought, oh my goodness, did I write that? And you know, it always feels like a test. So I promise I'm not going to test you, but I'm going to start with something that you wrote. So you don't need to tell me the page number. When talking about biblical teaching, I thought this was quite significant for this time that we're in at the moment. You wrote, when it comes to the holy habit of biblical teaching, community and creativity are vital. So too is context. Where we are, as well as who we are, affects how we engage with the Bible and how the Bible engages with us. And that seems to be really sort of a pertinent phrase for the time we find ourselves in at the moment.
Oh, I think so, definitely. And again, when we did that home group series, it began again just as lockdown was beginning, and the direct application of biblical texts to the COVID crisis, I think, was really, really striking. And again, it doesn't need to be a crisis like COVID, but for me, you know, there's a risk with a phrase like biblical teaching. We can think it's just about swallowing and memorizing verses, and you get a prize if you can quote Romans 8:27. I've no idea what that verse says, but actually, for me, it's the living of biblical teaching that's really, really critical. We don't want caricatures like Dot Cotton in EastEnders, who goes around quoting verses of scripture and then is a complete living contradiction of those things. I think for me as a disciple and for me as a minister encouraging others, the big challenge is how does the word become flesh in me, and how do I live out biblical teaching wherever God has called me to be. Now, Mark Green, who's going to be with you next month, I think is really good on this, and the whole sort of LICC emphasis on whole life discipleship. And I think the Holy Habits materials encourage something similar. It's the day-to-day living of this stuff that really, really matters. So if I'm an accountant, how do I apply biblical teaching to my work as an accountant? If I'm a homemaker, how do I apply it there? And so on. If I'm out and about doing my shopping, how do I treat the staff with courtesy in a way that's consistent with, the biblical teaching and so on?
And I think it's quite useful as well for the community that studies together as well, isn't it? For that to kind of grow. And I mean, we will shortly move on to fellowship, but just staying with this, I think it gives you all a vision together, a vision for the church to move forward, and people grow as disciples when they study God's word together.
Yeah, and I think again, this is where we bring that word together in again, Stuart. I quote a lady in Holy Habits called Sylvia Wilkie Collinson, who is an Australian Baptist, I think. And she talks about this notion of co-produced learning. And sometimes in the church, and I'm caricaturing it horribly here, we have perpetuated, what you could call an expert and idiot culture. And we kind of venerate the speaker who talks very eloquently and assume that everybody listening to them is just an empty vessel waiting to be topped up. When actually, the biblical model of teaching is way more participative and collaborative than that way. I mean, my thinking was revolutionized when somebody pointed out to me that Jesus's teaching methodology was one of shared learning. He would get a group of people together, begin to teach them, tell them a story, whatever he did. And he allowed, by facilitating a conversation, the truth to emerge in the midst of that. Now, Jesus, we believe, was truth incarnate, but he just didn't come and say, this is what you need to know, let me tell you it. He actually worked with people so they discovered the truth that he was encouraging them to discover in the midst of their conversation. So I think biblical teaching is particularly effective in our gathered worship, but particularly in our small groups and other gatherings, when we enable that learning to be done in community, and everybody has that opportunity to contribute, even if it's like in the Acts communities, the contributions coming from the children asking lots of questions. That facilitates the learning.
And I think there is that lovely moment that I hope we've all experienced when we've been part of that group, when something just suddenly comes and makes sense to us, and often from, as you say, from an unexpected source, that enables everything to drop back down into place for us. And I know from personally, they're some of the most cherished conversations and cherished times I've had in all kinds of strange and different places, sometimes in a formalized setting, sometimes and more often in an informal setting that's taken place around that conversation with kind of friends. And I guess not wanting to shoehorn us on to the next kind of idea of fellowship, but I mean, I do like this idea that you talk about, kind of this going back to authentic fellowship and authentic community. And I know some of the deepest time I'd ever with somebody who'd said they were going to be part of listen to this tonight. We share together in some great times that when I look and I kind of go through your book again, unconsciously ticks off all those things. We ate together, we prayed together, we studied together, we shared together, but so much of it was built around this idea of community, that we almost in a sense belong to God but belong to each other as well. And for me, that kind of really captures this idea of fellowship.
I mean, shortly after I kind of began to travel with Holy Habits, I went to Bristol, and the churches there had come across a video produced by Christian Aid, and it was produced entirely independently of Holy Habits, and it featured a group of young adults. I'm guessing they were still in their sort of early to mid 20s, sat around a table in a garden having some food together. And even at that age, they were reminiscing about the type of fellowship that they missed from their university days, when they used to hang out together and have pizza together and look at the Bible together and so on. And I found that fascinating. The group so young, they were already lamenting the loss of meeting in that way. Now, okay, we must be honest, sometimes life takes over. When you are a student, you might not realize it at the time, but you tend to have more time to do that kind of thing than when you've got a career and a mortgage and family and all that kind of stuff. But, I think it's, again, instructive about those times. If we look at our own growth as disciples, when has that been most accelerated? And it's tended to be where those fellowship things are in place. Roger Walton, the Methodist minister, has done a lot of research about what helps disciples to grow. And surprise, surprise, he kept coming back to the value of good, supportive, informative small groups as part of that development.
And I think that's been particularly for us a challenge during COVID at the moment, that fellowship, and yes, some people can get together on platforms such as this, but somehow it still kind of can lack. Have you heard of any kind of group that come up with some kind of ingenious way of being, keeping that idea of fellowship up?
Yeah, I mean, there's a community in a little town called Stone, just north of Stafford, between Stafford and Stoke-on-Trent. A church there, it was a joint United Reformed and Methodist church where the building closed, but actually the fellowship continued, St. John's Church in Stone. And, they faced this issue during the pandemic of how do we maintain that sense of being together, of fellowship. They have many folk who are shielding, many folk who've got to stay at home. So again, they studied the regulations carefully. and they were very, very careful in what they thought it was appropriate to do. And a group of folk in that church felt called, led, whatever, to actually become what they've called themselves, a traveling band of disciples. And so they go around to the homes of those who are confined to their homes. Now, I don't know if they meet in their gardens or through the window or what they do. But it's almost, well, they can't come to the gathered church, so let the gathered church or a small cohort of that go to them. And again, it's simple, it's doable. Again, the IT stuff wouldn't work with those people.
Mm-hmm.
So they found a way of meeting safely in close proximity to continue that sense of fellowship.
That's a great example of people's, I guess, ingenuity as well as answer perhaps to prayers. I guess one of the other things that we have missed in our time of isolation, and we continue to miss in many cases, is the idea of breaking bread together, and very much in a kind of sacramental sense of breaking bread. And you use some great examples in the book about our different understandings of breaking bread together. And in Liverpool, which is part of Mersey Synod, obviously we had the great example of Barbara Glasson and the bread making church. And I know when I was training for ministry, I was very lucky to spend a year where I had as a kind of tutor, and I went to see what happened there. It was a great example of doing church in a different way that connected with something that was most primitive in us, this need to break bread. And I love the story of a man that you met on the bench who got his bread out for you and explained which bread went best with everything. What would you want to say, I guess, about breaking bread in this particular time, but this idea of a sacramental act versus a kind of extension of fellowship, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot of debates out there at the moment, Stuart, about breaking bread, Holy Communion, what you can and can't do, is online communion appropriate, and so on. My own denomination is having huge debates about that, and I don't really want to get into those this evening. But again, have we been guided back to Acts 2:42 in recent years? Is God saying to us, just have a look at these practices and see what you can be done. Don't be so worried about regulations and all the weight that goes around those. Because the breaking bread that we have in the Acts passage, again, the context is really interesting. Luke says they broke bread at home. So they didn't trot up to the temple or another public space. It was very much a domestic thing, which is, of course, how it began. The Last Supper took place in a home. It's domestic context stuff. So I'm always keen to say, please honour the traditions of your denomination. I don't want to get anybody in trouble for breaking any rules and whatever. But I think the text, and I've read all the commentaries on the text, and the consensus among the commentators is Luke's phraseology about breaking bread is ambiguous. He may have been talking about an early embryonic form of what we might now call Holy Communion. He may have been talking about breaking bread as part of the everyday meal, but remembering Jesus as people did it. Now, there's nothing to stop anybody, any follower of Jesus, doing the latter anytime, any place, anywhere. There's nothing in the Bible that says you can't. There's nothing in any church rule book that says you can't. So I think let's not get in a tangle about exactly, the fullness of what you can do with bread and wine. Just break some bread. That's what it says in the text. You can do that at home. You can do that on your own. You could do that, with somebody. If you're hooked up online, you could both sit with a piece of bread. Don't get yourself into trouble using liturgies you shouldn't or whatever. But just that very simple act of breaking bread. It was actually a friend of mine on that park bench, Stuart, Indigit Bogle, who did it with Albert the homeless man. But, and part of the point of that story is that Indigit is a former president of Methodist Conference. So somebody upholds all the appropriate disciplines of the church. But they were able to have that powerful experience of meeting Christ in broken bread that I think anybody can have in any place.
Absolutely. I had a lovely experience. We had my mum come and stay once the lockdown had been lifted, and my mum moved into our social bubble, and and came and stayed with us. And she did church online, and she said, "Oh, we've been doing communion." She said, "But I feel bad because I forgot a piece of bread, but all I had was my crumpet." And I said, I'm sure God won't mind that you broke bread with your crumpet and not with a
Yeah,
piece of Warburton's, white sliced loaf." Um,
yeah.
I think what we're learning, and I just want to bring in a question that Hillary's
Uh-huh.
asked with us here. What we're learning is that we're having to, I guess, readapt things that are there, have been around. We're looking at, you said right at the beginning that you look at the text in Acts, and it constantly brings new things out for us. And I guess we're learning new things now. And Hillary wants to know, we're learning how to live in a modern day exile. What new holy habits do you think we need to adopt that keep faith in our current situation?
That's a really good question. What new habit? Ah, well, I don't know if it's a new habit as such, but I think it's that there may be something around being open um, to where the Spirit is taking us and how things are going to change. Um, I think this crisis time has forced change upon us that I think in our heart of hearts many of us knew were coming. And I was talking with a friend of mine today about our local situation and how when this crisis passes, as we trust it will, how many of our local chapels will actually reopen. Now, I think many of us have known for a little time now that actually at some point some of those may have had to close anyway. So this has accelerated all of that. And so I just wonder whether it's, what physical spaces we have, what online community we adopt, actually practicing a habit of being open and more willing to take the risks, more willing to follow the Spirit. Maybe we're being forced into that practice of new openness, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful to think about terms in that way. I wonder as well. I just want to move on to thinking now about prayer, and I'd just like to re-quote a bit of your book to you, if I could.
Yeah.
That I really liked. Who we are is how we pray. This idea we get too precious about the ways we find it most helpful to pray, and there's kind of this idea of just relaxing naturally into who you are in the way that you would pray, and that seems to be really, really relevant. I don't know at the moment, for the times we find ourselves, and I found my prayers over the last few months changing, and I had some sort of real affinity with the psalmist to just getting angry and rejoicing and thankful and all those kind of things in the space of a 5-minute kind of conversation with God. And what could you say about prayer at this current time, do you think?
Well, I think you mentioned the Who We Are is How We Pray. That's the title of a book by Charles Keating that I found really, really helpful, where he maps personality styles onto preferred patterns of prayer. And again, I just think we need to be a bit honest, Stuart, that when it comes to like patterns of prayer, when it comes to styles of worship and so on, actually, at the end of the day, the style that we prefer will be heavily dependent on our personality type. So therefore, we shouldn't get too precious about our preferred style, because actually what's appropriate for me may not be so appropriate for you. And I think this can be particularly true with prayer, nor be threatened by how other folk pray. If people want to shout at the ceiling in their prayers, well, fine, that's not my style, but if it's helpful to somebody else, let it be so. So I think I found that book enormously helpful. And again, I think like you during this time, I also, been back to the Psalms. I think quite a lot of people have. Because I think the rawness and the honesty and the lament tradition within Psalms is really helpful. John Bell's written a really good book about praying with the Psalms, again, that I read during lockdown and found really, really helpful. So yeah, that's been good. And I think, again, just actually using the gift of time that we've had to spend more time in prayer. Because again,
yeah, and I guess at a time when we felt there's so little we could do, that's one real powerful way as Christians that we can is to pray.
And I think also it's a gift, it's a missional gift we have to offer to others as well. I mean, I get a bit knocked really when we set up a false dichotomy between pastoral ministry and missional ministry. And there's been a massive risk we've done that in the mission-shaped church era. It's been mission, mission, mission. And, you know, pastoral care, that doesn't matter. Well, actually, one of the most effective forms of being missional is to exercise good pastoral care, but beyond, and not just within the church community. And I've been really surprised, actually, when occasionally I've taken the brave pill and offered prayer for people who are not practicing Christians in public spaces, particularly on Facebook. Now, I think I confessed to this in the book that one of my guilty secrets is stock car racing.
Okay.
And I'm quite well known within the stock car community because I'll turn up a lot of the meetings. I know quite a few of the drivers and officials and so on. And again, a couple of months into the lockdown, one of our most prominent drivers died from coronavirus. And I just actually read a prayer, and I thought, I just had this conviction that that would be really appropriate for Pete and his family. So I took some time to think about it, and then I posted it on the Stock Car Facebook page, and I post regularly on those pages. And it was the most liked post I've ever put up by a ratio of at least 2 to 1. And people were so grateful. And these are not the sort of people that you would normally see in church or anywhere else, but that offering was made in that community. So I think prayer is something that we can offer to others as well, particularly in these times.
And I think that reflects many people's experiences, the need to find something beyond themselves in difficult times as we're faced at the moment. And it kind of takes us, I think, onto the next habit of that of giving, because I mean it was giving something of yourself really in a sense of vulnerability. I like the idea that you put from your teacher. The idea of explaining the difference between an offering and a collection. An offering, he said, is what you give to your guests when they come round for a meal. A collection is what you gather up and give to the dog afterwards. I've been talking to a friend of mine who runs an A&E department, and obviously she's been through incredibly hard times and continues to go through incredibly hard times now, and particularly as they think forward to the winter and what that might look like. But she said one thing that's kept them going is like local restaurants and takeaways and all kinds of different people who just brought them gifts and things. And they said they have a room they call the wobble room, where so if anybody's having a wobble at work that day, they can just go in there and they put all kinds of different foods. And she said actually the gifts that they've received, that kind of giving that felt like it came from the depths of people's soul, has really kept them going. And I wonder, how can we as Christians give in this time?
Well, I think, praise God, many are. And I mean, not just Christians as well, Stuart. I mean, I think that's been a wonderful thing to see, really. And I think the Holy Spirit's active in all of creation, really. So, I think the giving in terms of, all the sowing that's been done, all the food that's been given, all sorts of ways, the time that people have given, the resources that have been shared, has really been quite wonderful. And I think, we are at, I was preaching on Jeremiah on Sunday, stand at the crossroads and if this isn't a crossroads in human history, I don't know what is. And I think, we have big questions as Christian community, as church, as country, as a world, as we go forward and as we emerge from this, just who do we want to be? And are we going to resort and revert to, rampant selfish consumerism, which is destroying the planet? Or are we going to take forward the practices of giving that we've celebrated during this time, and actually be more generous and responsible in our giving, so that, you know, the human race can continue into the future, because climate change will kill far more people than coronavirus. So I think what we've learned about sharing resources and giving in these days is absolutely critical for the health and well-being going forward.
And for me, I think when we talk about giving, it moves us on to the next habit as well, because they almost become intertwined, and that's the idea of service.
Yeah.
I think it connected with me. So I was really, the picture you paint of the church in the West Midlands, where, you know, the classical concert was what the church was offering, and the bookmakers opposite, and the pub or whatever. And I think, because I can relate to that, and I'm sure lots of people will be able to relate to this idea of what the church offers is so often not actually what the community wants or needs, and how we create that dialogue. And again, this seems like a crossroads, doesn't it, to say, you know, how can we, the church, serve you, the community?
And I think that was one of the one good lesson that's come from Fresh Expressions as well, Stuart. It's not the exclusive learning of Fresh Expressions. Many others have learned it before and since. But actually, if we're going to be effective in our service, we need to ask people, what do they need? I mean, one of my favourite Fresh Expressions is Wesley's Playhouse in Yorkshire, where they converted the old chapel into a playhouse. It was the first sort of soft play centred church in the country. There are many more now. And that all began with the vision of one laywoman who thought, we've got to be able to do more than we are doing, and a church that actually was willing to ask its local community, what did they need? And I always remember Caroline telling the story when they actually went out and asked people, what would you like? What would you need? They were astonished, because they said, when has the church ever asked us that question before? Normally the question only comes and asks us for things that they need, rather than saying, what do you need? And the stated need in that community was they needed somewhere safe for their children to play. So they kind of plagiarized the Wacky Warehouse style facility, adapted their chapel to provide that, and, you know, within 3 years it had 40,000 people through their doors. So, you know, I think that very, very simple question, what is it that you need, is how really effective service begins.
And they're really pertinent questions that we as church communities can be asking now, aren't they, to those in this particular time? What do you need from us as we go through this difficulty?
And you know, asking the good people in the community, the you know, the counsellors, the people at the GP's practice, the head teachers in the schools, you know, just ask, really. I think we can waste an awful lot of time and energy second guessing what people need. It was Mike Moyner, who was a colleague of mine at Fresh Expressions, who rather in exasperation one day said, if you want to know what Christians and non-Christians are thinking, just ask them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so often we second guess, or
or have a multi-million-pound research project.
Yeah.
Just go and ask people.
And perhaps we could do it, you know, when we eat together, which is kind of the next habit we're going to be thinking of. I mentioned earlier that one of the churches I was lucky enough to exercise ministry in was we did a kind of different kind of worship, and this worship, when we first started doing this act of worship together, it finished with a meal, and we all said, do you know, we enjoyed the meal so much, it should begin with the meal together. And so that's exactly what we did. We began with a meal where we ate together, and we shared stories as we ate, and we had somebody come along for the first time, and during our kind of active worship, which wasn't songs and, you know, it was prayer, it was discussion, it was activity, this person opened up with a great deal of depth of the story that we were then able to talk and, I guess, pray with her about, and to work through, not just over that evening, but over a number of months. And she said at a later date that she would never have had the confidence to share that story with us had it not been that we first of all sat down and we ate together. And I think there's something so powerful about eating together that builds and forms trust. And that's something that would be so wonderful to be able to do at the moment, and yet is one of the things that is so difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I'm more and more convinced actually with all the holy habits that they're not just good habits of discipleship. I think they're good habits of human beings. And I think eating together is deeply human, it's deeply primal actually. And it's not just the human race. Look at other animal species. They will gather around food and so on. So I think it's something that's hardwired into creation actually. I was doing a service at a church in Worcester where they were launching a Holy Habits journey, and they decided to do it in a cafe church style way, so all around tables, all around food. We had a wonderful time together, and at the end I was chatting with folk, and a guy came up and introduced himself. Hi, I'm Paul Jackson. And then he told me something that I'm glad I didn't know at the beginning of the service. He said, I'm a professor at Birmingham University. I'm so glad he told me that now, not at the beginning. I'd be terrified. And he explained not only was he professor of politics, but he also works for the United Nations. And he goes to, some of the most violent or what were previously violent areas, beginning to recover from war, and often civil war, which is the worst of all wars, of course. And he said, you know what we do, don't you? And I said, no. He said, well, the first thing we do with the previous warring parties is we get them together, not around a presentation, not in a committee room, not around a piece of paper. We get them together around a meal, and we just eat with them. And he said, that is the foundational building block in building the peace, eating together. And, Jesus ate together with people all the time. There are 70 references, I think, to food and eating together in Luke's gospel alone. And again, you look at the fruitful movements in the church in this country in recent years, Alpha, Messy Church, to a lesser extent, Holy Habits. What have they all got in them? They've got eating together as a key ingredient. And so, you're right, Stuart. I think more of that in our shared life, and it's difficult at the moment. But again, if we've got time to think, let's think about how that might be part of what we are able to offer when we can gather together again.
It was interesting. I was my wife works as a university lecturer, and she was on a webinar to do with the course that she teaches, and she was saying that they'd been talking and said what they do for someone. She teaches events, so event management, and they were saying that some kind of online events have been getting everybody to set their virtual background to be the same, and that makes everybody feel like we're all in the same room together. And I wonder, actually, as we do more things online, can we share the same food? Can we put ourselves in the same setting? Can we do more to kind of share that experience, as good as it is, and trying to find some joy in that moment, as difficult as it may be. Gladness and generosity. I received an email today asking me to take part in something that was looking at mountaintop experiences. Okay. And again, in gladness and generosity, this is something you talk about, this idea of mountaintop experiences. Mountaintop experiences are great, but we can't spend our life at the top of the mountain, can we? Sometimes we have to come back down into the valleys again, and it's how do those mountaintop experiences sustain us? I've often thought for the journey back down again, I always remember something that Steve Chalk said a number of years ago. He said the problem is so often we only ever see other people's mountaintop experiences. So in other words, we only see across the mountain range. We don't see them in their struggle down one side and their climb back up the other side. We only see them when they're at the top, and we think, oh, well, wouldn't it be great if our life was like that? And I think if there was ever a time now, then we need to rely on our mountaintop experiences and think about gladness and generosity. Then it's this moment and clinging on to joy. How do you manage to kind of cling on to joy, gladness, generosity at the moment?
Well, I think, valuing family and friends, and, really making the effort to keep in touch. Again, we talk a lot about togetherness, picking up the phone. Because, again, I think, one of the downsides of electronic communication. We can text in a second, we can put in a tick or a like on Facebook or whatever. But actually, you know, the joy of the conversation, the joy of the careful listening. I mean, I've, like many, I think, have really enjoyed reconnecting with nature. We're blessed to live, you know, about half a mile away from some open countryside, so we've discovered new walks. I've had the joy of growing my own veg, which I've never done before. And I just think, you know, some of those simple pleasures and living life a little more slowly have actually been quite restorative in terms of restoring joy, and have offset the possibilities of despair because of, you know, the restraints of this time. Just some of those simple pleasures, you know, have been real joy givers.
Yeah, and I think that's good, and I think it's great that we can then share our hopes and that joy with others in a careful way, because I'm conscious sometimes we can, you know, we shouldn't be kind of superimposing our joy on somebody else who needs to be in a period of lament, as we talked about earlier. But we can give, can't we? And be generous at that time. I think for me, when I was thinking about this evening, this next kind of habit of worship seemed to be one of the hardest ones, and the ones that I've heard so many people say we miss the idea of being able to worship collectively together. And it was good to be reminded that worship is very much a way of life. How we live should be an expression of worship, as well as those acts of coming together, which undoubtedly people will want to get back to as soon as we safely can. And some churches are exploring how that can be done, and some are actually doing it at the moment. Say something to us about worship in this current time.
Well, I mean, it is a strange time, I think. I mean, you're quite right, Stuart. I mean, I'm always keen to, and again, I think Mark Green would do that, may say something about this when he's with you as well. I am really keen to see worship as a way of life, because I think our default thinking is we think worship, we think 11 o'clock for an hour on a Sunday morning or whenever it is. Now, that's a hugely important part of it, but it's not the totality. But having said that, I think actually the question of how we worship together is a really prominent one at the moment. So clearly many of us have been exploring gathered worship online. I've been part of quite a number of different online expressions of worship. I still think there's a lot of learning to be done there about what content is appropriate. I mean, in particular, how we use things like music and singing. I've had some very good experiences of that. I've had some very bad experiences of that. So how do we, if sung worship is important to us, how do we do that well in an online space? I think is a particular challenge. I think one of the positives, both in online worship and actually in gathered physical worship, which locally we're beginning to do again, is actually making more use of visual imagery, both as an offering of worship, so offering the good photos we're taking and other things like that, but actually also as an aid to facilitating worship. I think our worship, both online and in gathered space, needs to be much more visual, because even in gathered space, of course, at the moment, we're not allowed to sing. So actually not being able to do some things gives us space to think about other things we might do. So, you know, visual imagery, symbolism, obviously you can't touch it, you can't all touch the same things, but actually using the different senses in different ways, because so much of our normal worship diet is auditory. It's about seeing and hearing, and yet there are the other three senses that we could make more use of. And again, we have an opportunity to learn in these days about how we might do that more,
I think as I've been thinking over lockdown and a lot of the other webinars that we consider have kind of touched on this one. And that's this last habit of making disciples seems really really difficult. And I like the way in the book that you talk about that so often the Christian church's emphasis has almost been making disciples as a ticket into heaven, where actually it's so much more. It's about transforming lives. It's about wholeness of life now. It's experiencing heaven in the present and not just in the future. But it seems one of the most difficult habits to be able to do when we're in a time of lockdown. And yet for me, I think you've already touched on this in some ways in the story of offering prayer to the family of a friend who's died in different ways. Is there anything else that you might want to just share about your experience of making disciples in this current time?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a shared experience, Stuart, that I think was it the Tear Fund research showed that more people were accessing online worship and other things as well. Now, let's not get too carried away. That's possibly because there were less other things to do. The pub's closed, there's no live sport on telly. I might go and have a look at that church service. Now, I'm not being cynical there, but I'm just being realistic.
Mm-hmm.
So again, a bit like with Jimmy Dunn's comments on the idealism of Acts 2, I think we need to be a little bit careful with the research that has shown that more people have accessed worship online and other things online. I know a number of people have offered alpha courses online and actually had a higher level of participation than when they've offered them in physical space before. So I think, every crisis brings its opportunities. And I think in terms of whether it's an evangelistic course like Alpha or offering worship online that people may be curious about and want to come into, then, this time of crisis has afforded those opportunities. I think the challenge will be developing relationships with people on an ongoing basis who might have got in touch online, because it may well be possible that you can continue to develop relationships online. But I maybe I'm just an old fuddy-duddy, but I still think human beings have been designed by God for physical interaction. So I'm not sure you can do everything online. And so how can we encourage people who've met with us online to meet with us in physical space is going to be important. And actually, again, having the generosity to go back to that habit to help those new folks shape what the new future will be like, and not just expect that we will revert to the patterns we've always enjoyed. Because people have opted out of those patterns already. If we simply revert back to those, when people will opt out of them again.
I think as well that at the end of the book, you encourage us and invite us to dare to dream is the title of your last chapter. Yeah. When we think about different kind of stuff like that, what is it that you would want us to dream of, perhaps? What would you encourage us to try and dream about?
Well, I think I'd just encourage you, Stuart, to follow your dream. And that's a sort of inclusive you, not just an exclusive to you dream. To follow your dreams, because in a way, Holy Habits is a living example of that. When I set out to write this little book, the deal with the publisher, Malcolm Down, who's a really good friend of mine. Love Malcolm. We grew up together in the same church, lifelong friends. But the deal Malcolm has with anybody who writes a book is if he's happy to publish it, the author has to buy the first 500 copies. Because that basically covers his production.
You've got to be pretty committed to that then, haven't you?
Indeed you have, because if nobody buys it, you are left with a big bill and a big pile of books. To be honest, when I did write this, I was actually genuinely worried as to whether we'd get rid of those first 500 copies. Now, we've got rid of them about 30-fold more than that now. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a natural writer. I'm more of a scrapbooker and assembler of ideas. But I had the dream to do that, and, it's become what it's become. So, I offer that in all humility and say, if you've got a dream, if there's something that God has laid on your heart, then give it a go. You know, get those critical friends around you who will both encourage you and say, hang on a minute, what about X, Y, and Z? But with that impetus of the Spirit and those wise and supportive friends around, why not you?
Andrew, with those words and that encouragement, that seems like a really great place to leave it. Thank you so much for your time tonight. I hope others have been encouraged by your words. As we go and as we spend our own time in prayer tonight, is there anything that you would like those watching and listening to be able to pray for you about?
Well, I just think at the moment, you know, it's like everybody else. I'm thinking about what next. So, you know, what is there another book to be written? Is there another piece of work to be done? So, you know, I think just that sense of God's guidance for me on what the next step in my journey is to be. So, yeah, I'd leave it at that, I think, Stuart. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and it's been good to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Well, bless you. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Al. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.